We have next our keynote speaker, James Yee, who will be talking about his experience being Muslim in post-9/11 America. Yee is a former Army chaplain and graduate of West Point who served as the Muslim chaplain in Guantanamo. He arrived at Guantanamo in November of 2002. After being officially recognized for outstanding performance, Yee was arrested and imprisoned in a naval brig for 76 days while on leave in Florida in September of 2003. He was subject to intense government investigation, and eventually all charges were dropped. In October 2005, Yee published an account of his Guantanamo experience and struggle for justice in his book, God and Country, Faith and Patriotism Under Fire. In June 2006, Yee earned his master's degree in international relations. He now lectures on his ordeal, Guantanamo Bay, Islam, Asian American and religious diversity issues, and the challenges of protecting both national security and civil liberties. So please join me in welcoming James Yee.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear? Okay, great. It's an honor and pleasure to be here in Bellevue today to once again have the opportunity to share with all of you a little bit about my experience as a Muslim American in this post-9/11 era. And I continue to do this as long as I know that it's helping in the effort to protect our civil liberties and our freedoms here in the United States. A real short, brief summary of my background. I'm a third-generation Chinese American, third generation. So it was my grandparents who came to the United States, my parents, my dad who actually turned 83 this month, and my mother, just 7 years younger, were born in the United States. All of my brothers and sisters and I born in the United States. As you heard, I'm a former military, a graduate of West Point, former officer. I served actually first as an air defense artillery officer and then later became a chaplain, one of our nation's first Muslim chaplains to serve the U.S. Armed Forces. But not only am I military and have that in my background, but I actually come from a family that is rather rooted in the military. My younger brother is also a graduate of West Point. My other younger brother is a doctor, a physician, an Army doctor serving today at Fort Hood in Texas. And my dad, as I mentioned earlier, was born here in the United States. He too also served in the Army back in World War II when he was drafted. So all of the men, all of the males in my family have actually served in the military, and that's something we're proud of with regard to each of our individual contributions towards protecting freedoms in this country. And a third aspect of my background is being a Muslim convert. I converted to Islam back in 1991, shortly after I graduated West Point. And that story in and of itself, my journey to Islam, is a whole nother presentation and lecture that maybe one day I'll have the opportunity to share with you my journey to Islam and how I was inspired by my first trip to Mecca as a new convert to Islam. But it was in late 2002 when I was late 2002 when I received the orders to go down to Guantanamo Bay and to serve as the Muslim chaplain. I actually re-entered the U.S. military, re-entered active duty in January of 2001 as a Muslim chaplain. As I mentioned, I previously have served as an air defense artillery officer. But in 2001, when I re-entered or was reactivated, came back on active duty into the officer corps. This time it was as a Muslim chaplain. That was in January of 2001. That very same year, 2001, we all know what happened just 9 months later, September 11th. The tragic attacks on the World Trade Center, the attack on the Pentagon. There was a fourth flight in Pennsylvania that would go down, all on September 11th. I was a Muslim chaplain serving at Fort Lewis, right here in Washington State at that time. And I was someone who said immediately following these attacks that those who carried out these attacks, whether they were Muslim or whether they weren't Muslim, had to be brought to justice because there were innocent lives that were taken. All right. It was almost immediately following these attacks that I was approached by senior level leaders at Fort Lewis. And I was asked to begin training troops, educating troops, soldiers about Islam and the Muslim culture. Why? Because I would say at that time, following 9/11, immediately following those tragic attacks, our leaders in the military knew that troops were going to be deployed to Muslim countries. Muslim countries like Iraq, like Afghanistan, and the many other Muslim countries where we find the majority of our troops deployed to today in the Muslim world. Right? So I was tasked to educate troops and train them, teach them something about Islam and the culture of Muslims. Right? And in those sessions, I would answer the many questions that troops had about Islam. Right? And many of them came away with a better understanding of the faith, of my faith, the faith that I converted to. And many of those soldiers actually did deploy to Afghanistan or Iraq, or maybe both countries, or maybe 2 or 3 times over. And maybe some of those troops who attended my sessions at Fort Lewis never came home. Right? But nevertheless, during that time, in that immediate post-9/11 aftermath, I received some praise and recognition for that contribution, educating our troops about Islam, knowing that they were going to be sent to these Muslim countries. One of the other things that I was asked to do immediately following the attacks was also to be a spokesperson for Muslims in the military and to handle the many questions that media people had about Americans who were serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, American Muslims who were serving in the U.S. Armed Forces following those attacks of 9/11. And I began to receive more recognition. I became sort of like the point person. I've often characterized myself during that time as perhaps being what you might call a poster boy of what it is to be a good Muslim in the U.S. military, representing those American Muslims who were patriotically serving, right? And I believe all of that recognition that went as high as the Pentagon and the State Department during that time got me handpicked, chosen, specifically selected to serve as the Muslim chaplain down in Guantanamo Bay after our troops did go into Afghanistan. And then under the Bush administration, this place called Guantanamo Bay was opened to house prisoners that were taken into captivity. And I was sent there in late November of 2002. And at first, when I was sent down there, I wasn't sure exactly what my role would be. Right? But I knew that there were hundreds of Muslim prisoners who were being held down there. And I had read many of the media reports already of some of the misunderstandings that many of the people had about Islam down in Guantanamo. I recall reading, for example, how some female soldiers would comment and say, you know, these Muslims down in Guantanamo, these Muslim men, in the countries that they come from, the women have to listen to the men. But now they're here in Guantanamo, and they have to listen to us women soldiers, right? Or when I read about how these Muslim prisoners had to get their medical exams in this prison, some of the first doctors that they sent down to Guantanamo were female physicians. Many of the Muslim prisoners came from very conservative Islamic countries and societies. And in their mode of operation, in their mannerisms, wouldn't look at these women, these physicians in the eye, and felt very comfortable being touched by these female physicians. Right? And the women doctors in the military would comment to the media saying, these men in Guantanamo, these Muslims, they look at us women as if we're poison. They won't even look at us in the face. Right? But they weren't looking at women in the face because in the Muslim culture, that's done out of respect, not to look at someone in the eye of the opposite sex, whereas in our society, in our communities, here in the United States, when we speak to someone, we look eye to eye, and that's a show of respect. But in that culture, where many of these Muslim men came from, they would avert their look out of respect for the woman that they would be speaking to. Right? So you had many misunderstandings, and that was something that struck me when I was sent to Guantanamo. And I knew that was something that I could help educate people about, cultural practices of Muslims and Islam. But I still wasn't sure what other role I would have in Guantanamo. But when I got down to Guantanamo, I learned that I did have 2 other roles One was to be an advisor to the camp commander on religious practices. The religious practices, the Muslim observances and worship practices of the prisoners being held in Guantanamo. And at that time, there were close to 700, about 660 or so Muslim men being held in this prison. Right. So that was my first role, an advisor to the commander. The other role that I had was to be a chaplain to all the Muslims in Guantanamo. Not just the prisoners in the cells, but I was also a chaplain to the many American Muslims down in Guantanamo. Yes, there were also American Muslims in Guantanamo, but they weren't prisoners. Imagine, you have 660 or so Muslim men in Guantanamo who came from about 40 different countries. So how many languages do you think were spoken in Guantanamo? Many, many languages. From Arabic, Pashto, Farsi, Urdu, Turkish. There were some prisoners from Western China, Chinese, known as the Uyghur Muslims. Many from Europe, speaking French and German, right? Russian. Who would handle the linguistic needs of this military operation? Translators, American translators, most of whom were American Muslims because of the diverse languages, right? So these American Muslims down in Guantanamo were also part of my congregation, so to speak. When I held the worship service on Friday, our weekly worship service on Friday at the base chapel in Guantanamo, it was American Muslims who were serving this joint task force down in Guantanamo who could attend. The prisoners couldn't. They were confined to their cage-like cells in the prison camp. But I was a chaplain to the American Muslims, and I was also a chaplain to the prisoners. And in my role as a chaplain to the prisoners, I was given, granted, authorized, unescorted access into the prison cell blocks. I was one of the very few people in Guantanamo who was allowed to openly speak and communicate with the prisoners. Right? And what did I learn from that communication? I learned a lot about what was going on inside Guantanamo, how prisoners were being treated, or should I say how prisoners were being mistreated, abused, subjected to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, subjected to practices that could quite possibly be characterized as torture. Right? And it wasn't only this information that I was receiving prisoners who complained to me about how they were being treated, but it was also from many of the translators who worked inside these interrogation booths and in the interrogation operation who came to me in confidence, concerned about some of the things that were being done to the prisoners. Right? So I would raise concerns about some of these things to my chain of command. And at first, I actually felt as if my chain of command valued the input that I brought them. But what was that input? What were the concerns that I was raising to my chain of command about how prisoners were treated? What I saw in Guantanamo is what I call how the military and other federal agencies in Guantanamo used religion as a weapon. Used religion as a weapon to persecute the individuals being held in Guantanamo. Religion was being used as a weapon. And because each and every prisoner in Guantanamo is a Muslim, it was essentially the use of Islam, the Islamic faith, against these prisoners to try and break them in the course of trying to extract information or intel from them, or just to abuse and humiliate them. Okay? And how was that being done? We heard back in 2005 reports that eventually hit the news that the Holy Quran, for example, was being desecrated in Guantanamo. A big controversy, because when that news broke, there were Muslims around the world that protested and demonstrated against the U.S. for the Holy Quran being desecrated in Guantanamo. And during those protests, some of the governments and law enforcement quelling these demonstrations, people were killed. But why were so many people around the world upset when the Holy Quran was desecrated? Because Muslims all over the world view the Holy Quran as the literal words of God. the literal words of God. If you went into any Muslim home, you find the Holy Quran placed on the highest shelf in one's home, out of respect and reverence for what we consider to be God's word. Right? In our sister Abrahamic faiths, you find similar traditions. If you went into a Jewish synagogue, where do you find the Holy Scriptures? Right? In the front of the synagogue in what's known as the Ark. And sometimes it's under lock and key. And sometimes it's very much protected that maybe even the rabbi is the only one that actually handles the scripture or is authorized to script it. Right? This is done out of reverence, out of respect for what is considered to be the words of God. And in Islam, we have that same tradition. So when personnel in Guantanamo, U.S. personnel in Guantanamo, intentionally abused the Quran, desecrated it, they understood the belief of Islam, of Muslims who respect the Quran as God's word, and knew it would infuriate prisoners down in Guantanamo. But that was just one way in which they took an aspect of Muslim culture and tried to exploit it for military intelligence operations. Another way involved the very competitiveness of the interrogation operation in Guantanamo. It was a very competitive process. You had federal interrogators competing against military interrogators. Right? You had women interrogators competing against male interrogators. But you know what? Some of the women believed they had a slight advantage over their male counterpart. And what was that advantage? Their gender, their sexuality. Because they knew that many of these Muslim men came from very conservative Islamic cultures and societies. Maybe many of them, young, never married, had never even been in direct physical contact with a woman before in his life, other than family members. You know, hugging your mother or your sister or your aunt or something like that. Right? Some of these women were very ready to go into an interrogation session and strip off her own clothes in front of a shackled Muslim male prisoner in Guantanamo, thinking that would frustrate him. Right? They would go further than that. Some of them would inappropriately rub their own bodies on these shackled prisoners who couldn't resist. Right? Things like that. This was done because it was understood that there's a separation in the Muslim culture between the sexes. In this room here, we find men and women sitting together. But if you go into any Islamic center, you find a place for women to pray and a place for men to pray. Even in America, Islamic centers are organized in that fashion. Right? In Guantanamo, U.S. personnel would exploit this aspect of Muslim culture, again, to try and break the prisoner and humiliate them, to try and get intel information in this military operation. Right? Again, using religious aspects of religion as a weapon against these prisoners. Then there was one prisoner who came to me with a story about what goes on inside some of these interrogation rooms. And he described for me an interrogation room that had marked on it, inside it, a large circle on the floor. It was a large circle, right? But inside that circle was another symbol. You might call it a religious symbol. Some people might call it a religious symbol. It was a pentagram star-shaped symbol that represented Satan, the satanic symbol, that satanic star marked on the floor in the center of this satanic circle. Right? And an interrogator would take this prisoner and force him in the center of it and attempt to make this prisoner bow down and prostrate, like in the form of the Islamic prayer. Perhaps when you've seen Muslims pray, and many might observe us when we make our noon prayer later, how we bow and we prostrate. We put our forehead on the ground in honor and worshiping of one God. These interrogators would attempt to force Muslim prisoners in the center of this satanic circle to bow down and prostrate in this satanic circle, while they would scream at these Muslim prisoners that Satan is your God now, not Allah. Meaning not God the Almighty, God who created all things, the heavens and the earth. Right? And this was done because personnel in Guantanamo understood the core belief of Islam, which is to believe in one God. And they tried to break Muslims from this belief. And were humiliated when they were forced in these satanic circles. But these are just ways in which the military in Guantanamo and federal agencies used religion as a weapon against the human beings in these cage-like cells. Right? Now, when you look at the history of the United States, those who landed on Plymouth Rock, right, the Pilgrims, they came because they were in search of a place where they could practice and worship freely. Even if it was their own puritanical interpretation of religion, they wanted a place where they could worship freely. And they came to America to do so. Right? But now, today, instead, you had the reverse of that idea. To use religion to persecute, to humiliate human beings. And in my view, that was not the American way. Or that is not the American way. That was against our values as a nation. And I question whether this was right as to what we were doing in Guantanamo, and raised concerns to the chain of command about these practices. And as I mentioned earlier, I actually believe that my chain of command in the detention side of the operation valued that input because they would praise me. My supervisors and the colonel would recognize me. I had a stellar officer evaluation report during the time I was in Guantanamo. I received actually 2 official military awards down in Guantanamo. And I was actually recommended for a 3rd, higher award, which I would receive at the end of my year-long deployment to this prison camp. The information and input I brought to my commander would help solve many of the problems within the detention side of the operation, to curb some of the abuses on the part of the guards. But my commander in the detention side of the operation had no direct influence on what was going on in the intelligence side of the operation. There was another commander overseeing that operation. So the abuse inside the interrogation rooms continued to occur. Right? But that commander in the intelligence operation probably didn't like hearing that the chaplain in Guantanamo, the Muslim chaplain, was raising concerns about their interrogation tactics, the humiliation, the use of religion as a weapon against these prisoners, the potential torture that was taking place inside those interrogation rooms. And as I mentioned, I thought my input was valued. And what led me to further believe that was I received what's called R&R, rest and relaxation. It's for any soldier who's deployed during a lengthy period of time. They can actually earn maybe 2 weeks out of the combat zone to go home, see their family, see their loved ones, maybe be rejuvenated, re-energized, and then get sent back to their military mission. I got that R&R after having served 10 months in Guantanamo. I got on a plane from Guantanamo, landed in Jacksonville, Florida. I had a connecting flight from Jacksonville back to SeaTac. But I never made that connecting flight to SeaTac. Why? Because at the Jacksonville Naval Air Station, when my plane landed there, I was met by some people, many people, customs and immigration officers, who searched my bags. And then they would claim that I was carrying in my backpack some suspicious documents. Suspicious documents. And though they never identified them or even knew what they were, they just said it seemed suspicious that a chaplain would be carrying these documents. Right? And then all of a sudden, there were intelligence officers there on the scene. Army counterintelligence, naval criminal investigators, FBI. 2 agents of the FBI appeared miraculously out of nowhere. Right? Well, of course, they were there ready for me. It was a sting operation. And then these intelligence operatives, these intelligence officers would claim I was carrying classified documents. And then they got an arrest warrant, and I was put in prison in secret. Nobody knew I had gotten arrested and was thrown in prison. My wife and my daughter were waiting at SeaTac for me to arrive, and I never showed up. My wife waited hours, and when I didn't show up, she would call my parents in New Jersey to see if maybe my plans had changed, and I had contacted them. My parents heard nothing. It was like I had disappeared in America. Where was I? Well, I was sitting in a prison cell in Jacksonville, Florida, And then a week later, I was transferred to a super maximum security prison down in Charleston, South Carolina, a facility known as the Consolidated Naval Brig. Right? This is the place where the Bush administration held what's termed U.S. citizen enemy combatants. Foreign enemy combatants, we know, were held in Guantanamo Bay and still are today, and in other CIA black sites. But if you were declared an enemy combatant and you were a U.S. citizen or were taken into custody on U.S. soil, you were sent to the Consolidated Naval Brig in Charleston, South Carolina, and that's where I was sent. Held alongside people like Jose Padilla is one name. Yasser Hamdi was another. And the U.S. military would state in a public interview that me, Captain Yee, being sent to this prison in Charleston, South Carolina, was only a coincidence. They said it was only coincidence that we sent Captain Yee to this same prison where other U.S. citizen enemy combatants were being held. But for me, it was no coincidence, and how do I know? Because when they transferred me to this prison, I was shackled at the wrist, at the waist, the ankles, in a suit of chains, in the same way that they shackle prisoners in Guantanamo. Right? And in the back of this truck where they threw me, the armed guard next to me would take out of his bag these plastic goggles. Plastic goggles. And they were painted black. And he put them on my eyes so I couldn't see anything. Right? He took out of his bag these industrial-type ear devices, ear muffs, and then placed them over my ears. Now I couldn't hear anything. So I'm shackled in a suit of chains. I can't see anything. I can't hear anything. I'm being subjected to something which is known as sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation. But this was something I knew about. How? Down in Guantanamo Bay, when prisoners got in process, they were subjected to this sensory deprivation. And it was done to instill fear, intimidation, confusion. And when I recognized that I was being treated in the very same way that these prisoners in Guantanamo were being treated, I feared that all of my rights were now just being stripped by my own government, even as a U.S. citizen, because I understood what President Bush had said at the time, that the prisoners in Guantanamo don't have any rights. Geneva Conventions don't apply. And now I'm being treated in the same way. I'm in the same shoes as the prisoners in Guantanamo. I fear now that all my rights are being stripped. Well, eventually I was put in this single solitary cell in Charleston, and I was held there for 76 days. As accusations swirled in the media due to government leaks that I was a terrorist spy. I was being accused of spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, mutiny and sedition. And these offenses are capital crimes that you can be put to death for. And in a pretrial confinement hearing, indeed, a military prosecutor would threaten me with the death penalty, telling my legal counsel at that time that they better get qualified in capital cases because this is where they were going with it. They wanted to give me the gas chamber. But I was in that jail cell for 76 days. After 76 days, I was suddenly released, never charged with any of these offenses. They would charge, the military would charge me later with what they called mishandling classified information. They attempted to make the case that I had took sensitive documents from Guantanamo Bay, and they still wanted to hold me accountable for that and keep me in jail. I was still facing about 13 or 14 years in prison for these offenses, multiple offenses. We went to a pretrial hearing, and in that pretrial hearing, one of the first things that my legal counsel that I retained from Washington, D.C., an individual named Mr. Eugene Fidel, president of the National Institute of Military Justice, in my view, perhaps today's foremost expert in military law. One of the first things we did was we demanded from the U.S. military, from the government, that they reveal what classified documents I had taken from Guantanamo. And the military would respond saying that anything that they had seized from me, they had not even actually, at that point, conducted any official review and could not state definitively that I even had classified documents. So the judge immediately delayed this pretrial hearing. That hearing was delayed several times after, 5, 6 times, and then it was never resumed. Even those charges were then dropped. I was sent back to Fort Lewis, reinstated as a chaplain to serve the troops. How long do you think it took for me at that point to tender my resignation from the U.S. military? After I was reinstated, I tendered my resignation, and in 2005, January, I received an honorable discharge. And when I separated from the U.S. military, I was even given a second U.S. Army Commendation Medal for, quote, exceptionally meritorious service. How do you figure that one out, right? How do you figure that out? But I think that award that I received was admitting that they made a mistake. I never received, even to this day, an official apology from anyone in a position of leadership or from the U.S. government or for the U.S. military. Many good-hearted citizens from around the world have apologized for the way I was treated, but I never received an apology from the U.S. military or anyone in an official position of leadership. Right? But when I received that award, to me, that was an admittance that they made a mistake, that what happened to me was a gross miscarriage of justice in this very dangerous post-9/11 era. But that's my story. And I believe it's very relevant to what's going on today. As the topic of this workshop is civil liberties in peril, I am someone who believes that our civil liberty, the first step to our civil liberties being in peril, is first striking fear into people that a certain group is dangerous, that they're suspects, they're bad people. And this is what we who are defending the rights of Muslims in America call Islamophobia. Right? And before I conclude, I want to show some relevant things that are going on today with Islamophobia. And I want to show you a couple pictures. Islamophobia. These are just some photos that I picked off the internet that kind of reflects this fear of Islam, fear of Muslims. It was even the feature on a recent Time magazine asking the question, is America Islamophobic? Real quick, Islamophobia, fear of Islam and Muslims, can generally be defined as the following: an irrational fear and hostility towards Islam and towards Muslims. And it can lead to what? Discrimination, profiling, violation of constitutional rights, hate crimes, anti-Muslim rhetoric. And the executive director of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, Washington chapter, or Seattle chapter, Arsalan, who's here, he will tell you that even in Washington, there are so many incidences of this stuff going on right here in Washington State. I'm doing the same thing in New Jersey and battling the same things there. Okay. But Islamophobia didn't start with 9/11. I remember the Oklahoma bombing back in 1995. The first group that was suggested that carried out this bombing were Muslims. But there have been some things that happened in the recent news that has contributed to this fear and hostility, like what happened at Fort Hood. Major Nidal Hassan, who actually did take the lives of 13 fellow service members, a Muslim. Right? And this guy who tried to bring down this airplane, this underwear bomb, right? But he was so good at what he was doing that instead of setting off this underwear bomb, he burned himself, in the bathroom of the plane. Right? But guess what? His parents had saw signs that he was being radicalized or extremist, and they themselves contacted the CIA about their son being, off the rocker. How was he able to get on a plane? Right? This guy, Faisal Shahzad, who tried to set off this Times Square bomb recently, right? Didn't succeed. Why? Because a Muslim called 911. The first call to the police was a Muslim in Times Square who saw the smoking car bomb. Muslims are today, American Muslims, are on the front lines of actually thwarting any possible extremism that may exist within the Muslim community. But that's not what Congressman Peter King was saying 2 months ago when he held these hearings in Congress. He's the chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. Held a hearing into the, quote, radicalization of American Muslims. He singled out American Muslims for extremism. Yes, we want to fight extremism and radicalism, but why only single out American Muslims? By doing that, you miss things like Columbine. You miss the guy who goes and shoots an Arizona congresswoman, right? You miss Virginia Tech, right? You miss the guy who flies his plane into the Texas Federal Building, the IRS building in Texas. None of these people were Muslim. And if you focus only on Muslims, what are you saying? Here in Washington State, this is something that happened actually while I was in Guantanamo, but I heard the news. Right? One of our prominent imams, a prominent imam right here in Bellevue, Mr. Muhammad Joban, right, was asked when he was serving as the imam down in Olympia to give the opening invocation in the state legislature. And when he did so, there were two state representatives who walked out of that prayer. One of them was this woman, Lois McMahon. And when asked why she walked out, she said, because it's a matter of patriotism. It's an issue of patriotism. She saw it as her patriotic duty to walk out of this prayer because it was given by a Muslim. There was another individual who walked out, and when he was asked why he walked out, he said that he walked out because Muhammad is not my God. Well, we had to educate that that legislative representative in Washington State that Muhammad is not the God of Muslims either. We don't worship Muhammad, right? So this showed the lack of knowledge, the ignorance of what even goes on with our elected representatives. This guy was actually in Congress, I think from Colorado, when responding to an interview question on the radio, saying, what could the U.S. do in response to a hypothetical biological attack by Muslim extremists? He said the proper thing would be to take out Islamic holy sites, like bomb Mecca, for example. Right? But then our community actually made strides when our nation, elected the first American Muslim to Congress in 2006, Mr. Keith Ellison from the 5th District of Minneapolis. Right? And when he was elected, one of the first things he did was he announced, when I take my photo op, the swearing-in ceremony, I'm going to swear in on the Holy Quran. Right? And that was controversial. This one congressperson who was serving would state in response to Keith Ellison's announcement that Representative Keith Ellison's desire to use the Quran during the swearing-in ceremony was a threat to, quote, the values, beliefs traditional to the United States of America. Right? This was Virgil Goode. He's no longer a congressman. Right? But what did Keith Ellison do? A friend of mine now, someone who I was actually campaigning for during his primary election and then the general election when he was elected that first time around. What did he do? A very savvy politician. He went to the Library of Congress and he borrowed the translation of the Quran that was owned by Thomas Jefferson. Owned by Thomas Jefferson. Right? And in this picture you see with Nancy Pelosi, he's swearing on the Quran that was owned by Thomas Jefferson. Many people know that Thomas Jefferson's library was destroyed in fire, but one of the few books that survived was his translation of the Quran. Thomas Jefferson was a scholar of the Quran, right? And that shows in the Constitution where the forefathers wrote into our Constitution freedom for all people to worship as they choose, right? Other things that have been said about Keith Ellison. This guy's a shock jock, a radio guy, has suggested things like banning Islamic centers in the U.S. for the construction of mosques, or banning immigration of Muslims to the United States, right? So we see this anti-Muslim rhetoric also coming from media people. This is something that I saw recently on Real-Time HBO. He had this discussion. Bill Maher said, I think it's fair to say that Muslim men, meaning all Muslim men, have a bad attitude about women in general. So he's casting this caste type stereotype on all Muslims. Right? So that first step to putting our civil liberties in peril is striking fear of the entire group, painting a broad brush of an entire group that they're bad or dangerous people. In 2008, Islamophobia was in the election campaign. That famous fist jab, which is now very popular as a greeting, right, was called a terrorist fist jab by a Fox News analyst, right? And then the New Yorker magazine would take that fist jab and satirize it, putting it on the cover in that famous photo, where they dressed Barack Obama up in what someone might call Muslim garb, right? Michelle Obama wearing a belt of AK-47 ammunition around her shoulder. Right? Again, trying to give this impression that Obama might be this Muslim in disguise, closet Muslim, right? As if that would be something bad. And if you happen to be a resident in Rensselaer County in New York during that election and you voted by absentee ballot, this is the ballot you might have received. It allowed you to vote for John McCain and Sarah Palin, but it didn't allow you to vote for Barack Obama. It allowed you to vote for Barack Osama and Joe Biden. Right? But of course, the election committee said that was only a typo. That was a typo. Another Fox analyst who recently referred to the president as Mubarak Obama, insinuating that Obama is a dictator. And then when policies do take place, like the TSA, when they formalized this policy that said they were going to have heightened security for passengers who came from certain countries. But look at the countries that he put on this list. They're all Muslim countries, except for Cuba. And then the new scanners that they put in place. When you take the reverse imaging of these new scanners, very much an invasion of privacy. Relevant today, some of the things going on, the controversy in New York City over the AKA Ground Zero Mosque. But what did Mayor Bloomberg say? He said, we would be untrue to the best part of ourselves and who we are as New Yorkers and Americans if we said no to a mosque in Lower Manhattan. So Mayor Bloomberg, in my opinion, stepped up to the plate and defended the religious freedom of Muslims in New York. Pictures of Ramadan, last Ramadan, in that Park 51 mosque, that Ground Zero mosque. But those were the protests that were being held to try and stop this mosque or cultural center from being built. We see protests of Islamic centers going on all across the country. There are some cases that I'm dealing with in New Jersey. Same issue, right? This is a protest in Connecticut. This is a hate sign that was left at a mosque in California, and it reads, "No temple for the god of terrorism at Ground Zero." At Ground Zero, this is in California where they left this sign, and they're talking about Ground Zero in New York. This was something that was left at another California mosque in Sacramento. A pig, like a toy pig, and it's written on it, "Remember 9/11." And on the bottom it says, Moham, like Mohammed. They pointed out the H-A-M in Mohammed. Everybody knows what ham is, right? It's pork. Muslims don't eat pork. This mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, was the feature of a recent CNN piece by esteemed journalist Soledad O'Brien called "Unwelcome: The Muslims Next Door." And she featured this community, and you can see the community, they want to build an Islamic center. First, the community came out and protested. Then it went to vandalism. They destroyed the sign and spray painted it. Then they resorted to arson, setting ablaze the construction equipment on site being used to build this mosque. Even following the death of bin Laden, a mosque that is being built in Amherst, New York, the neighbor puts up on the lawn, "Bomb-making next driveway," meaning the new mosque next door. This was written the same night that the news was released that bin Laden had been killed. In Portland, Maine, at a mosque, it reads, "Osama today, Islam tomorrow." Osama today, Islam tomorrow. Right? So even today as we speak, we see this Islamophobia, and as the current director of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations in New Jersey, along with all of my other colleagues with the CARE chapters throughout the United States, we are combating this Islamophobia to protect the civil liberties of American Muslims who are here today. This is an incident that did happen in New York within the last year. Passenger got in a taxi cab and asked the driver, "Are you Muslim?" And when the Muslim driver said, "Yes, I am Muslim from Bangladesh," the passenger reached across the seat and slashed his throat with a knife. Right? The driver, fortunately, God bless, was not killed. But it shows what can happen because someone has anger towards someone because of their faith, can turn very violent. This is a famous picture known as the soiling of Old Glory, where we see in this photo, taken in 1976, someone using the American flag, what? To attack someone of color. Right? The American flag they're using. Right? So we ask, is this what's happening today? Is America Islamophobic? Right? So these are the things that through our efforts we can change, and through workshops like we have today, and the dedication and the commitment that good people in America have towards ensuring that everyone in this country has freedom and is treated equally, we can defeat this type of thing. Right? So with that, I want to conclude here and again reiterate that it's very much an honor and pleasure. I've had an enormous support from the Unitarian Universalist community throughout the country, inviting me to speak and present and to give my comments about this growing trend of Islamophobia and the fight for civil liberties. And it's an honor again to be here in Bellevue to participate in this program. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for listening. Thank you very much.
Okay, our first question. What about Wahhabism and the more radical elements of Islam and their attitude towards civil rights? Could you speak a little bit about that?
This question is actually more geared towards an Islamic scholar with regard to what is Wahhabism. And generally, just in general terms, people seem to refer to the type of interpretation of Islam as Wahhabism as coming from the area of Saudi Arabia, as a type of puritanical view of Islam, a very rigid interpretation. No doubt within the Muslim world, in some places where they practice Wahhabism, there are violations of civil rights. But as Muslims here in America, we are also working to try and change that as well, to show the beauty of Islam that allows for the equality of all people and for the aspirations of people to take place.
Thank you. The next question is, and this is a little bit along the lines of religion as well. How do you reconcile the concept of separation of church and state within Sharia law?
How do you reconcile the concept of separation of church and state within Sharia law? Okay. Well, first we have to explain what is Sharia law, right? And then separation of church and state. Here in America, we live in a society that is governed by church and state. And as Americans and as the Muslims who live here, we accept that. We accept that. But we also recognize that within the Constitution, it allows us to freely practice our religion as well as it allows everyone else to freely practice their religion, right? Sometimes I address this question with regard to my military service. You might even ask, under separation of church and state, how is it that you have military chaplains, rabbis, priests, imams, Muslim imams, clergy, being paid for by U.S. paid tax dollars to provide religious services for troops, right? And actually the courts have upheld the aspect of the role of the chaplain to defend the religious rights of military personnel, to employees who work on installations, as the primary purpose that allows a religious clergy person to work in a government institution, right? So there are a lot of questions and issues with regard to separation of church and state. With regard to Islamic Sharia, for me, Islamic Sharia is basically the code of conduct that I follow to try and be a better person by following my faith. That dictates I should pray 5 times a day, that I should give some of my wealth to people in need, that I should fast during the month of Ramadan, right, and whatnot. There's actually a trend through the United States, and I've heard that in over 20 states, legislative bodies have introduced bills and legislation to ban, quote, Islamic law or Islamic Sharia. when actually it's impossible for Islamic Sharia to be implemented here in the United States under our governing laws that we have that exist today. My question is, why are our legislators wasting taxpayers' dollars and time on something that is essentially impossible to do here? Ban a Sharia law. When Sharia law can't be implemented here in the United States anyway as a governing type body of law.
Next question, can you explain what CARE stands for and a little bit more about the work that you do with CARE?
CARE. CARE is the Council on American Islamic Relations, and we are essentially known as an American Muslim civil rights organization. But we have a five-fold mission. We defend the civil liberties of American Muslims and advocate for the civil liberties of all people, create dialogue. We enhance the understanding of Islam, right? The two other missions, we partner with other organizations that are also advocating for mutual justice or justice and mutual understanding. Like, for example, today we see a partnership between the Muslim community and the Unitarian Universalist community. So partnering with other communities that are also advocating for mutual understanding and justice. And then we also work to empower American Muslims. So advocating for Muslims to get involved in the political process, for example, as Keith Ellison did, as the second congressperson, the Muslim American in Congress, Andre Carson, and as many other American Muslims have engaged. Myself got a little bit involved during the Obama campaign and was elected in Washington State as a national delegate to the Democratic National Convention. So that helps empower the American Muslim community so that our voice is also heard and represented. So those are the things that CARE does.
Thank you. Next question. Are you under investigation for speaking out about the events that you went through with Guantanamo?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I am. With regard to my personal case, when I went through that Guantanamo ordeal, I do know, and I have seen documentation that I gained through a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, where I got some documents from the U.S. military that indicated that the case against me in the military was closed shortly before I resigned from the military. But whether or not there's an open case with the federal government, FBI, or whatnot, I have no idea. I do assume, for example, that I am under some type of surveillance. Perhaps my phone calls are monitored, my emails, whatnot. I assume that I am. I do know that this method that is used by the government called the National Security Letter, which is given to organizations when the U.S. government wants information from them I believe under the Patriot Act, can submit this national security letter to gain personal information, whether it's financial information or business transactions or library records, without a court warrant. I do know that a national security letter was used by the Pentagon to get into my banking records. That was mentioned in a front-page New York Times article back in 2007, I believe. So a lot of these types of trespasses, violations of our civil liberties, has been done on me with that type of thing. But as to whether I'm being investigated right now, I don't know.
A quick follow-up question to that. Are you currently in contact with any current Muslim chaplains in the U.S. Military? And if so, do you know of any current or even past experiences that were similar to your own?
Yes, I do know several of the Muslim chaplains who still serve in the U.S. military. I haven't been in contact with any recently. A lot of times when I do attend some of the national conferences and conventions, the American Muslim conventions, one, for example, the Islamic Society of North America has a very large convention, usually held during Labor Day weekend. Over the past few years, though, because of Ramadan and when it's been falling, it's been held during July 4th weekend. I see some of the military chaplains who still serve. I do know that many of the Muslim chaplains who serve our military were or have been under scrutiny, especially after I was arrested. But none has actually experienced to the extent of actually being put in jail like I have. Federal prison chaplains, Muslim prison chaplains, have also been very much scrutinized as well.
Thank you. This is a question about extremism in general. Do you believe that we can eliminate extremism, and if so, what do you think are the core strategies for going about doing that?
Can you eliminate extremism? I think you're always going to have people who hold extreme ideologies and ideas. But what we have to combat is when those types of individuals who do hold those extremist views, and they have the right to hold these views, right? What we do have to combat is when these individuals violate the rights of others or take steps where they can harm others, right? And we should develop core strategies to fight that, right? I think one of the things that helps increase our community, the security of our community, security of our homeland and our country exponentially, is if you partner with the Muslim community to combat extremism that might be within the Muslim community, right? But that's not what is happening today. Instead, Muslim leadership in this country, American Muslim leadership, American Muslim organizations, the mosques, Islamic centers are being demonized as being characterized as contributing to the fostering of this extremist ideologies. And that's like what Congressman Peter King was saying, you know, when he held these hearings. He's known to have said, you know, 80% of mosques in this country are run by extremists, you know, things like that. But I think the proper way to go about this is to partner with the Muslim community, to partner with the leadership, right, in order to combat potential acts of violence. And as I mentioned in some of the incidences that I showed up on the slide, American Muslims were the first to respond in many of the recent attacks or attempted attacks. In that congressional hearing held by Peter King, actually the sheriff of Los Angeles County, Sheriff Baca, testified that Muslims, specifically in California where he is, have been very instrumental in helping the homeland security, right? And testified that he has allied and partnered with American Muslims to create a safer community, right? I think the kind of plan and kind of strategies that this particular expert in law enforcement has implemented is something that we should look very closely at.
So the next question is, how can people get access to the information regarding other faiths such as Islam to educate our community in workshops such as this? Are there specific resources you can direct us to?
Specific resources for educating on Islam?
Yes.
Sure, I think in general, for example, our CARE National website has a lot of information, certainly has links to general information about Islam, but even more importantly perhaps, there's a plethora of information about the work that CARE does in defending civil liberties. For example, our organization submitted testimony to the King hearings on exactly how the American Muslim community has been instrumental in increasing national security and helping thwart threats, things like that. www.care.com, CAIR.com, right? And each individual, on that CARE website, you could also get links to each individual chapters. So there's a CARE Washington, CARE Seattle chapter, and if you want to follow the activity of the CARE chapter here in Washington State, there's a link there to CARE Washington as well.